Today I'm going to show you how to master these 10 basic watercolor techniques with scorpion lollipops. By the end of this video, you should be able to use these skills in your own paintings. If you're just starting out with watercolor painting, these techniques will give you the knowledge to confidently create the effects you want. So let's get started. So I just used a micron to get my line work down on the paper. I'm going to be using Neptune brushes by Princeton. It's important that you use a watercolor brush for this, just so that the techniques work easier for you. You can use any type of watercolor for this. I'm going to use just 6 colors. This is a high chroma set by Core. The flat wash is a watercolor technique that creates an even area of color with no streaks or brush strokes. It is achieved by spreading color evenly across the paper with a wide brush. The result is a flat, even, and uniform wash of color. A flat wash can be used to create a solid area of color or as a base for a more detailed painting. That is why it is essential to choose the right brush for this. You don't want to choose one that's too large for the area, but if you choose one that's too small, you'll end up with a lot of different brush strokes inside the area that you're trying to create a flat wash. The flat wash is the most basic of all the techniques. Essentially, you need to make sure that there's plenty of water in your paint to water mixture in your brush. If there's not enough water, your area will not self-level as much and you'll get more of an uneven wash. You just need to be careful around the edges, making sure that you're as tidy as possible. And while that paint's still wet, you can move it around if you need to even it out. A graded wash is very similar to a flat wash. Essentially what we are trying to do is fill in the area, same as we did with a flat wash, but this time we're going from a color to a really soft, transparent version of that color. So I'll use a large brush to plug in my first color, then I'll use a little bit more water for my second pass, just lightly going over the bottom area of the first pass. If you would like to switch down to a smaller brush at this time, you can. Fully rinse out your brush for the very last stroke. You want just water for this final part. You'll be able to move that color above it downwards, and you should have filled in your entire area with a wash that is graded from dark to light. While this area is still wet, you can take a smaller brush, go in and resaturate the top area if you would like to add more contrast. As long as your paper is wet, you should get really soft blends between your colors. So try playing around with your graded washes, especially if you're not happy with them. This is a very popular technique for painting skies. Now let's move on to the wet on wet technique. This involves applying wet paint into a wet surface. So first I'll take a clean brush with some clean water, and I'm just going to take that water and spread it evenly across the area that I want to apply the wet on wet technique to. You have to be very particular about your edges and make sure that the center part has a nice sheen to it. You don't want it to be a puddle, you just want it to be evenly wet. This wet on wet technique can create a variety of different effects, from soft diffused edges and subtly blended colors to an abstract look. Basically, you drop your paint into the wet surface. You can just kind of dab it on with your brush, and that paint will mix with the existing water that's on there or the existing colors and create that really soft blended look. This technique works really well with transparent watercolors as they blend together beautifully. And essentially, you'll just get a bunch of diffused edges within your shape. There are a lot of different variations of this technique where you can actually pick up your piece of paper and shift your color, moving it from side to side, changing the direction of those colors within the wet on wet area. The best technique, in my opinion, and the most basic, is to place the color and leave it. For this next one, we will want an even mix of water and paint on our brush. The wet on dry watercolor technique is very commonly used when you want to deliberately place color. It involves applying a layer of wet paint onto dry paper. When you apply paint onto a dry area as opposed to the wet area, like we just did for the wet on wet, you'll notice immediately that you're going to get sharp edges and more concentrated color. You can control the opacity as well by adding more water into your brush. Watercolor is all about learning how to control the amount of water and paint on your brush to create the different tones and values that you want. So this one is one of the essentials of watercolor and definitely worth practicing. Dry brush is the opposite of wet on dry in terms of the amount of water on our brush. We want to make sure that our brush has absolutely no water in it, so be sure to thoroughly dry your brush for the best results. If you have any water left in your brush whatsoever, this technique will not work nearly as well. Another thing for making sure that this technique is successful is dipping into watercolor that is not wet. You want to either move your watercolor brush against a dry pan or a dry glob of watercolor. So our bristles are pretty separated right now, and what we're going to do is just lightly move our watercolor brush over the paper. Dry brush is used to create a textured, painterly effect. It involves using a brush with a small amount of watercolor paint and building up those soft brush strokes on your paper. This technique is often used to create a soft, hairy, textured look. You'll see landscape artists using this to paint foliage, and it is often used in combination with other watercolor techniques, layered on top of each other to make a more varied and interesting texture in the painting. So those are kind of the basic techniques. These next 5 are, I think, a little bit more advanced. We're going to start off with Scumbling. This one is also really great for foliage. You want to make sure you have an even amount of paint and water on your brush. And essentially what you'll do is you're going to do all sorts of short, choppy brush strokes in one area to build up dimension. So what I like to do after I plug in my first initial area is go back through with just a wet brush and do that exact same thing right around the edges. It's going to give us an unpredictable shape while also being able to control our tones and values. And it gives us this choppy look, which is really nice for hard candy, actually. And I think that it works really nicely if you do the majority of it with a lot of gesture and do it pretty loosely. But if there's a tight area that you want to work around, you can always be a little bit more deliberate in some areas over others. Scumbling is a more detail-oriented technique that is often used to create interest or additional texture in your painting. To do this, you can just place this scumbling effect over top of an area that's already been painted with a base color. You can wait for your base color to dry or leave it a little bit wet for the softer diffused edge. You can see how in the right-hand corner I did it on dry paper and you get a lot more of a choppy, bold look, and over the wet paper it's a little more diffused. So the next technique is going to be called glazing. I'm going to start off by just painting my scorpion first. Now, the most important thing about glazing is that you want to make sure that your layer below is nice and dry before you place your next color. That way, it allows your first color to come through the second. Another thing to keep in mind is that you want your paint to be pretty transparent. If your paint is not transparent, you won't get the same effect. Now that our paint has fully dried, you need to make sure it's completely dry for this to work. I'm just going to take a larger brush, make sure that there's a lot of water mixed into it because I want the color to be very transparent, and in as few strokes as possible, lightly glaze over the first initial layer. make sure to let your layers dry in between glazing, otherwise you can actually lift that lower color out. So now that layer has fully dried, and I'm going to go back in with a smaller brush and continue to build up my layers. You can use different colors and mix those transparent colors to get new colors, or you can build up with the same color just to get a darker hue. And I'm also going to glaze a little bit, just one center part here, just to make it look like the scorpion is below the candy. The more water that's in your brush when you glaze, the more of a transparent, thin effect you'll get. So that's traditionally how people do it. They use really transparent watercolor and lots of water. So this one, just going to choose a color here, and I'm going to paint in my whole pop with it. Actually, I'm going to make it a little bit of a darker one. So the lifting technique is really great for if you accidentally made a mistake as well. I use this probably in every watercolor painting that I do. So you'll have your initial color placed, then you're going to want to dry off your brush, same as we did with our dry brush. Just use a rag or a paper towel and make sure it's really nice and dry. Then you're going to follow through with that brush and slowly go over the area that you want to lift up. Now, what it's doing is picking up that water from the paper. Depending on what paper you use and what pigments you use, this may work better with some than others. Using a high quality cotton paper will allow you to lift and scrub more, and some pigments stain a little bit more than others do. So no matter how quick you are to lift, they may still stain. Using a really nice thirsty brush like these Neptune brushes is also very helpful. Next, let's go on to dragging. Now, dragging is a technique that is commonly done with watercolor pencils, watercolor markers. Essentially what you do is you paint a line or an area of watercolor. Then you can switch over and just use water to blend that color out. You're kind of dragging it away and making it a little bit less saturated. So this way, you're plugging in any tones and values that you want throughout your piece, and then you're dragging that color away into a new area. This gives you a ton of different control and allows you to choose which areas have that color and which areas don't. Wherever you place your color will be the most saturated, and then any area that you pull away with your brush will be more muted and toned down. And this is one of those basic techniques that you can do a lot with. Think of this almost as the wet on dry technique, where we have our brush loaded up with paint and water, but then what we're doing is just taking a wet brush and spreading that outwards a little bit. So this is definitely one to practice as well. This is how the majority of watercolor artists really build up their illustrations. You can plug in your initial tone in really tight areas, but if you don't want that hard edge, dragging it away with water will help diffuse that color and blend it into the surrounding area. So this is going to elevate your watercolor paintings to the next level by allowing you to have full control over where your paint sits and how it blends out. Last but certainly not least, we have charging. Essentially what you're going to do is take your water and paint mixture, again, this is wet on dry to begin with, and we're just going to plug that color in. Now charging is going to be where you have that paint that's still wet, but you want to amp up either the color or maybe you want it to be a little bit darker. What you can do is just drop that paint or color directly into that wet area, and it will make it darker, and it will spread and diffuse within that wet paint. So it's kind of like wet on wet, where that color is going to blend amongst the other colors within that wet area. However, the edges, which are that really sharp, bold line, will stay that way unless you decide to move them or blend them out. So charging is really great if you've plugged in an area, but you want to add more definition and contrast. So again, I'm just going to start with a wet area, just using a little bit more water than paint. Then I'm going to rinse out my brush and go in with a darker color, and I'm going to just drop that somewhere within my wet paint. You can see how that color spreads, but it stays within wherever I've placed my first initial water pass. In my opinion, these 10 techniques are the most essential techniques that you have to know as a beginning watercolor artist. There are a couple more that I would definitely like to go over if you guys are interested, so please let me know if you like this type of video. I thought it may be helpful to do a couple of illustrations where I combine the different basic techniques that we just went over into more fleshed out paintings. That way you can get an idea of how the techniques can work together. So as you watch these short little time lapses, just keep that in your mind. What technique is going on top of what other technique, and how do they work together? I also thought it would be fun to do a giveaway of these 3 paintings. Today is my 30th birthday, so what better way to celebrate than to give away 3 paintings to 3 friends? So if you're interested in entering the giveaway, just leave a comment and you will be entered. That's all it takes. In 1 week, which will be next Sunday, May 14th, I will randomly select 3 people from the comments, and I will ship them one of these 3 paintings along with the sticker pack. So I will be sending you a message directly to let you know if you won. I hope that you guys found this information helpful. If you have any questions about these techniques, of course, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you have a wonderful week.